The wind off the Atlantic had always carried secrets. In the summer of 1992, the small coastal town of Tidewater Cove, Maine, was the kind of place where nothing terrible ever happened. Population 3,200. One main street, two churches, a bait shop that doubled as the local gossip hub. The kind of town where people left their doors unlocked, where children rode bikes until the streetlights flickered on, and where the biggest scandal in recent memory involved the mayor's affair with the woman who ran the ice cream parlor. But that summer, something changed. The air felt different, heavier, charged with an electricity that the locals couldn't quite name. Old-timers would later say they felt it in their bones, that prickling sensation that warned of storms even when the sky was clear. But nobody listened to old-timers anymore. This was the 90s. The world was modern now. Safe. Legend safe. They were wrong. Ested. On June 15, 1992, Daniel and Rebecca Hartley arrived in Tidewater Cove for what was supposed to be a 2-week vacation. They were young, 28 and 26 respectively, newlyweds celebrating their first anniversary. Daniel worked as an accountant at a mid-sized firm in Boston. Rebecca taught 3rd grade at an elementary school in Brookline. They were ordinary people living an ordinary life, chasing an ordinary dream of happiness. The beach house they rented sat at the end of Saltmarsh Road, that narrow strip of cracked asphalt that wound through scrub pines and seagrass before terminating at a cluster of weathered vacation homes. The Hartleys rental, number 42, was painted a fading yellow with blue shutters that rattled in the ocean breeze. It wasn't fancy. The floorboards creaked and the plumbing groaned. But it had a deck that overlooked the water, and at night you could hear the waves rolling in like a lullaby. And the property manager, a gruff man named Walter Finch, met them at the house that first afternoon. He was 61, built like a barrel, with hands that looked like they'd spent decades hauling lobster traps. He handed over the keys, pointed out the fuse box and the water heater, reminded them that trash pickup was on Wednesdays. "Any problems, you call the number on the fridge," Walter said, his voice gravelly from a lifetime of cigarettes. "But you won't have problems. Quiet as a church out here." Daniel smiled, slipping an arm around Rebecca's waist. "That's exactly what we're looking for." Walter nodded, studying them with eyes that had seen too many tourists come and go to feel much of anything anymore. "Enjoy your stay, Mun." And then he left them alone. And for the first few days, everything was perfect. Daniel and Rebecca fell into an easy rhythm. Mornings on the beach, collecting shells and letting the cold water numb their feet. Afternoons reading paperback novels on the deck, the sun warm on their shoulders. Evenings in town, eating fried clams at the wharf house, watching the fishing boats return with their hauls. They were happy. Anyone who saw them could tell. The way they looked at each other, the way their hands always seemed to find each other, fingers interlacing like puzzle pieces. On June 19th, they stopped by the general store on Main Street. The owner, a woman named Judith Palmer, remembered them clearly. She would tell investigators later that Rebecca had bought sunscreen, a magazine, and a bag of saltwater taffy. Daniel had chatted about the Red Sox game from the night before. They seemed relaxed, carefree, nothing unusual, nothing wrong. "Bulch. Have a good day," Judith had said as they left. Rebecca had smiled over her shoulder. "You too. Do." It was the last confirmed sighting of Rebecca Hartley alive. The next morning, June 20th, started like any other. Or at least, that's what investigators would later try to piece together. Then the weather was clear. Temperature in the mid-70s, light breeze from the northeast. On perfect beach weather, the kind of day that brings tourists out in droves. But something happened at 42 Saltmarsh Road that day, something that would haunt Tidewater Cove for more than 3 decades. The first indication that anything was wrong came from an unlikely source. Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, an 83-year-old widow who lived year-round in house number 38, noticed that the Hartleys' rental car, a burgundy Honda Accord, hadn't moved in 2 days. The car sat in the gravel driveway, undisturbed, collecting a fine layer of salt spray and pollen. Now, in a city, this wouldn't mean much. But in Tidewater Cove, people noticed things, patterns, routines, and tourists always moved their cars, always. They went into town for meals, for supplies, for sightseeing. A car sitting still for 2 days was odd. Mrs. Pritchard mentioned it to her neighbor on June 22nd. By June 23rd, when the car still hadn't moved, she called Walter Finch. "Something's not right," she told him, her voice thin and worried over the phone. "That young couple, the ones in 42, their car hasn't budged. I haven't seen them. Not once. None." Walter, who had dealt with paranoid elderly renters before, tried to brush it off. "Maybe they're just staying in, enjoying the privacy. For 4 days?" Mrs. Pritchard's tone was sharp. "Without going into town, without so much as walking on the beach. Walter, I'm telling you something is wrong." With a sigh, Walter agreed to check on them. He drove out to Saltmarsh Road that afternoon, the sun beating down on his truck's hood. When he pulled into the driveway of 42, everything looked normal. The yellow house sat quiet in the heat, and the shutters hung still. No signs of disturbance. Walter knocked on the front door. "Mr. Hartley?" "Mrs. Hartley?" "It's Walter Finch, the property manager." "Nothing." He knocked again, harder this time. "Just checking in, making sure everything's all right." That silence. Lens. Buntholes ends. Walter felt the first stirrings of unease in his gut. He tried the door handle, locked. He walked around to the back deck, his footsteps heavy on the wooden planks. The sliding glass door was closed but unlocked. He hesitated, then pulled it open. "Hello? Anyone home?" The house answered with silence. Walter stepped inside. The air was stuffy, warm, carrying the faint smell of coffee and something else he couldn't quite place. The living room looked undisturbed. 2 books lay open on the coffee table. A pair of sandals sat neatly by the door. Everything was clean, organized, normal. Too normal. Walter moved through the house slowly, his heart beginning to hammer in his chest. The kitchen was spotless. No dirty dishes, no signs of breakfast. 2 coffee mugs sat in the sink, washed and drying. In the bedroom, the bed was made, pillows fluffed, the duvet pulled tight without a wrinkle. But personal items were everywhere. Clothes in the closet, toiletries in the bathroom, Rebecca's purse on the nightstand, Daniel's wallet on the dresser, cash and credit cards still inside. They hadn't checked out. They hadn't packed. They were just gone. Walter's hands were shaking when he picked up the phone in the kitchen and dialed the sheriff's office. Sheriff Thomas Keller arrived 30 minutes later with 2 deputies. Keller was 49. A Tidewater Cove native who'd spent his entire career in law enforcement without ever handling anything more serious than drunk and disorderlies and the occasional domestic dispute. He was a competent man, respected in the community, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he was about to encounter. The deputies searched the house top to bottom. They found no signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of violence. Everything was in its place. Too much in its place, as if someone had carefully staged the scene. But there were anomalies. Small things that didn't quite fit. The bed was made with military precision, corners tucked tight, surface wrinkle-free. But Rebecca's mother would later tell investigators that Rebecca had never made a bed like that in her life. She was neat, yes, but not obsessive. The coffee mugs in the sink were bone dry, as if they'd been washed and left to air dry for days. But according to Mrs. Pritchard's timeline, the Hartleys should have been in the house as recently as the morning of June 20th. Fresh coffee mugs didn't dry that completely in just 3 days, especially not in the humid coastal air. And then there was the calendar. On the refrigerator, held in place by a lobster-shaped magnet, hung a small wall calendar. June's page was marked with neat pencil notations. Arrival date on the 15th. A reminder to call Rebecca's mother on the 17th. A note about low tide times on the 19th. But on June 20th, someone had drawn a single mark. Not a word, not a note. Just a small, precise X in the corner of the date box. Sheriff Keller stared at that X for a long time, trying to understand what it meant. Was it a countdown? A warning? A goodbye? He didn't know, and that terrified him more than he wanted to admit. The investigation kicked into high gear. Within 24 hours, the FBI was involved. The Hartleys' families were contacted. Daniel's parents drove up from Connecticut. Rebecca's mother and sister flew in from Ohio. They were frantic, desperate, unable to comprehend how two people could simply vanish into thin air. The agents canvassed the town. They interviewed every resident, every business owner, every tourist who'd been in Tidewater Cove during that week in June. They showed photographs of Daniel and Rebecca everywhere. Did you see this couple? Did you notice anything unusual? Most people remembered them, at least vaguely. The young newlyweds, the ones who seemed so happy. But nobody had seen them after the 19th. Nobody had heard anything strange. Nobody had noticed anything out of the ordinary. It was as if Daniel and Rebecca Hartley had been erased from existence. The FBI brought in dogs to search the surrounding area. They combed the beaches, the woods, the marshlands. They dragged portions of the cove, searching for bodies that they prayed they wouldn't find. They examined the Honda Accord with forensic precision, dusting for prints, analyzing fibers, looking for any trace evidence that might provide a clue. They found nothing. No bodies, no blood, no evidence of foul play. Just two people who had been there one moment and gone the next. Theories began to circulate. Maybe Daniel and Rebecca had staged their own disappearance. Maybe they were running from something, debts or troubles back in Boston. But their families insisted that was impossible, and they were happy, stable, deeply in love. They had no reason to run. Maybe they'd gone for a walk on the beach and drowned. But their beach gear was all in the house, towels neatly folded in the linen closet, the swimming suits hanging in the bathroom. And the tides in that area weren't strong enough to carry bodies far enough that they'd never be found. Maybe they'd been murdered, their bodies hidden somewhere the search teams hadn't looked. But there was no evidence of violence, no signs of struggle, no motive that anyone could determine. The case consumed Tidewater Cove for the rest of that summer. The news crews descended on the tiny town, turning the quiet streets into a circus of cameras and reporters. And the locals grew paranoid, suspicious of strangers, jumpy at every unfamiliar sound. Parents stopped letting their children play outside unsupervised. Doors that had always been left unlocked now had deadbolts installed. The vacation rental at 42 Saltmarsh Road sat empty, sealed with yellow crime scene tape that fluttered in the ocean breeze like a warning flag. Nobody wanted to rent it. Nobody wanted to even look at it. By September, when the leaves began to turn and the tourists stopped coming, the investigation had stalled. The FBI agents packed up their evidence and returned to Boston, promising to follow up on any new leads. Sheriff Keller filed the case away, though it never really left his mind. He'd wake up in the middle of the night sometimes, thinking about that X on the calendar, wondering what it meant. Daniel's parents hired a private investigator, a former Boston police detective named Arthur Brennan. He spent 6 months digging into every aspect of the Hartleys' lives, looking for anything that might explain their disappearance. He found nothing. Just two ordinary people living ordinary lives until the moment they weren't. Rebecca's mother appeared on national television, tearfully begging anyone with information to come forward. "Please," she said, her voice breaking, "if you know anything at all, help us bring our babies home." But nobody called with answers. Only the usual cranks and attention seekers, people claiming to have seen the Hartleys in California, in Mexico, in Canada. Every lead was investigated and dismissed. Years passed. The case grew cold. Tidewater Cove slowly returned to normal, though the scar of that summer never fully healed. Walter Finch eventually sold the property at 42 Saltmarsh Road at a significant loss. The new owners renovated it, painted it a different color, tried to erase its dark history. But locals still avoided it, still whispered about the young couple who'd vanished without a trace. Daniel's parents passed away in the early 2000s, their son's fate still unknown, his disappearance an open wound that never healed. Rebecca's mother became a shadow of herself, obsessed with true crime forums and missing persons databases, searching endlessly for answers that never came. Sheriff Keller retired in 2008. The Hartley case is one great failure, the mystery that had haunted him for 16 years. On his last day, he placed the case file in a box marked Unsolved and stored it in the basement of the sheriff's office, along with dozens of other forgotten tragedies. The world moved on. Technology advanced. DNA testing became routine. Cell phones became ubiquitous. The internet connected everyone. But the Hartleys remained lost, frozen in time, 28 and 26 years old forever. Until 2024. In March of that year, a massive nor'easter battered the Maine coast. Wind gusts reached 80 miles per hour. Waves crested at 15 feet. The storm surge flooded low-lying areas, tore roofs off buildings, toppled century-old trees. Tidewater Cove, like much of the coastline, took a beating. When the storm finally passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by nature's fury, the cleanup began. Residents emerged to survey the damage, to pick up the pieces to start rebuilding. And that's when someone found the hatch. The nor'easter had eroded a significant portion of the beach near Saltmarsh Road, thus carving away layers of sand and exposing sections of bedrock that hadn't seen daylight in generations. In one area, about 50 yards from the water's edge and roughly 100 yards from where 42 Saltmarsh Road once stood, and the receding sand revealed something that shouldn't have been there. A metal hatch, rusted but still intact, set flush into the exposed rock. A jogger spotted it on March 23rd. At first, he thought it might be some kind of old utility access, maybe part of the town's long-abandoned sewer system. But something about it felt wrong. The hatch was too deliberately placed, too carefully concealed. He took a photo with his phone and posted it to a local Facebook group, asking if anyone knew what it was. Within hours, the post had gone viral in Tidewater Cove. People began speculating wildly. Some thought it was a relic from World War II, when the coast had been fortified against potential German attacks. Others suggested it might be connected to old bootlegging operations from the Prohibition era. But some of the older residents, the ones who remembered 1992, felt a chill run down their spines. They remembered the Hartleys. They remembered the mystery that had never been solved. By the next morning, sheriff's deputies had cordoned off the area. The current sheriff, a woman named Patricia Dalton who'd grown up hearing stories about the infamous disappearance, stood on the beach staring at the hatch, the knot of dread forming in her stomach. "We need to open it," she told her deputies. It took a crew with cutting torches 2 hours to break through the rusted metal. The whole time, a crowd gathered behind the police tape, dozens of locals and curious onlookers, everyone holding their breath, everyone afraid of what might be hidden below. When the hatch finally gave way, releasing a hiss of stale air that smelled of salt and decay, Sheriff Dalton shined her flashlight into the darkness below. And what she saw made her blood run cold. A narrow shaft descended into the earth, roughly 6 feet deep, leading to what appeared to be a small underground chamber carved directly into the bedrock. The walls were smooth, too smooth to be natural. Someone had made this space. Someone had put considerable effort into creating a hidden room beneath the beach. And inside that room, preserved by the cool, dry air and sealed away from the elements for 32 years, were 2 bodies. They lay side by side on the stone floor, dressed in clothing that matched the descriptions from 1992. A man in khaki shorts and a Red Sox t-shirt. A woman in a sundress with a floral pattern. Their bodies were mummified, skin drawn tight over bone, hair still visible, features still recognizable from the photographs that had once been plastered all over the news. Daniel and Rebecca Hartley had been found. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. How had they ended up in that underground chamber? Why had their bodies been so carefully placed, almost reverently arranged? Who had built that hidden space, and for what purpose? And most disturbing of all, what had been done to them before they died? Because as the forensic team carefully documented the scene, As they photographed every angle and catalogued every piece of evidence, they noticed something that made even the most seasoned investigators pause. Both bodies bore markings. Strange symbols carved into their skin, patterns that didn't match any known language or cultural practice. The cuts were precise, methodical, made with something very sharp. They weren't random acts of violence. They were deliberate, ritualistic. Someone had taken Daniel and Rebecca Hartley on June 20th, 1992. Someone had brought them to that underground chamber. Someone had done terrible things to them in the darkness beneath the sand. And then someone had sealed them away, leaving them to be forgotten, to become nothing more than a tragic mystery that people whispered about on quiet nights. But now, 32 years later, the storm had given up its secret. The earth had revealed its hidden grave, and the investigation into what happened to Daniel and Rebecca Hartley could finally begin again. Only this time, the truth waiting to be uncovered was far darker than anyone could have imagined. The FBI returned to Tidewater Cove in force. Special agents from the Behavioral Analysis Unit set up a command center in the town hall, and forensic anthropologists from Boston University arrived to examine the remains. Cold case detectives from the Maine State Police combed through 3 decades of files, looking for connections, patterns, anything that might point toward a suspect. The national media descended once again, turning the peaceful coastal town into a circus. News helicopters circled overhead. Satellite trucks lined Main Street. Reporters did live shots from the beach, the yellow police tape fluttering behind them as they spoke in somber tones about the tragic discovery. Rebecca's sister, now 58 years old, flew in from Ohio. She stood on the beach where her sister had been found, tears streaming down her face, finally able to grieve properly after 3 decades of uncertainty. Daniel's younger brother, who'd been only 19 in 1992, arrived from Colorado, looking older than his 49 years. He was exhausted by a grief that had never really ended. The autopsies were performed by Dr. Lisa Rothman, the state's chief medical examiner. What she found would form the cornerstone of the renewed investigation, evidence that painted a picture of horror beyond anything the original investigators had imagined. Both Daniel and Rebecca had died from a combination of dehydration and starvation, their bodies showing clear signs of prolonged suffering. But that wasn't what killed them. Not directly. What killed them was being sealed in that underground chamber while they were still alive. The cuts on their bodies had been made post-mortem, or very close to it, and the symbols carved into their skin were deliberate, careful, performed by someone who took their time. Dr. Rothman estimated that the victims had been alive in that chamber for at least 3 days, possibly longer, before death finally claimed them. It was a death sentence carried out in the most cruel way imaginable. Buried alive in the darkness, with no hope of escape, slowly succumbing to thirst and hunger while the world above went about its business, oblivious to the horror happening beneath their feet. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigative team. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was calculated, methodical, sadistic. Someone had built the chamber specifically for this purpose. Someone had planned this for weeks, maybe months in advance, and that meant there was a monster living in Tidewater Cove. Or at least there had been in 1992. The question was, were they still there? The investigation in 2024 moved with a velocity that the 1992 probe could never have matched. The technology had transformed law enforcement in the intervening decades. What once took weeks now took hours. The DNA analysis that hadn't existed in the 90s was now routine. Digital databases connected agencies across the country, sharing information instantaneously. But some things remained unchanged. The fundamental questions still needed answers. But who had done this? Why had they chosen Daniel and Rebecca Hartley? And perhaps most importantly, had they done it before or since? Special Agent Monica Reeves led the FBI task force. She was 42, a veteran of the Behavioral Analysis Unit with a reputation for cracking cold cases that others had given up on. She'd spent 15 years studying the darkest corners of human behavior, profiling serial offenders, understanding the psychology of those who killed for reasons that normal people could never comprehend. Standing on the beach in early April, watching the forensic teams work the crime scene with painstaking precision, Reeves felt something in her gut, an instinct honed by years of chasing predators. This wasn't random. This was personal. And whoever had done this had gotten away with it for 32 years because they were smart, disciplined, careful, the kind of killer who doesn't make mistakes. The underground chamber itself became a focal point of the investigation. All forensic engineers were brought in to analyze its construction. What they found was both impressive and terrifying. The chamber had been carved out of solid bedrock using professional-grade tools, probably over the course of several weeks or months. The walls were smooth, showing evidence of careful finishing work. Whoever built it had knowledge of geology, engineering, construction. This wasn't amateur work. This was someone with skills, resources, and most importantly, access to the location. The hatch had been custom fabricated, welded steel with a locking mechanism that could only be opened from the outside. Once someone was sealed inside, there was no escape. No way to call for help. No possibility of rescue. It was a tomb designed for the living, a place where victims could be left to die slowly in complete darkness. But the most chilling discovery came from the metal itself. When forensic metallurgists analyzed samples from the hatch, they found microscopic traces of paint embedded in the rust. Not just any paint. Marine-grade paint specifically used on fishing boats and commercial vessels in the late 80s and early 90s. The manufacturer's chemical signature matched a brand called OceanGuard, commonly used by boat maintenance yards along the New England coast. Records showed that in 1992, only 3 businesses in Maine carried that specific product line. One was in Portland, too far away to be relevant. Another had closed in 1988. The third was Harborside Marine Services in Tidewater Cove. Agent Reeves felt her pulse quicken when that connection came through. She pulled the original case files, searching for any mention of Harborside Marine. And there it was, buried in a deputy's interview notes from July 1992. Walter Finch, the property manager who'd discovered the Hartleys were missing. He had mentioned in passing that he'd worked at Harborside Marine for 20 years before retiring to manage rental properties. Walter Finch. The man who had the keys to 42 Saltmarsh Road. The man who knew when tourists would be arriving and leaving. The man who had access to the property at any time, for any reason, without raising suspicion. Reeves immediately checked Finch's status. He'd died in 2017 from a heart attack, age 86. His death had been natural, witnessed by staff at the assisted living facility where he'd spent his final years. If Finch was the killer, he'd taken his secrets to the grave. But Reeves wasn't satisfied. Something felt incomplete. Finch was connected to the material evidence, yes, but did he fit the profile? She pulled his background, his work history, his personal life, looking for red flags that might have been missed in 1992. Walter Finch had been born in Tidewater Cove in 1931. He'd served in the Navy during the Korean War, working as a mechanic on destroyers. After his discharge in 1954, he'd returned home and started working at Harborside Marine, eventually becoming the head welder and fabricator. He married in 1956, had 2 daughters, lived a seemingly normal life. His wife passed away in 1978 from cancer. He retired from Harborside in 1989 and began managing rental properties to supplement his pension. On paper, Walter Finch looked like every other working-class man of his generation. Nothing remarkable, nothing suspicious. But Reeves knew that monsters rarely looked like monsters. They looked like neighbors, co-workers, the guy who fixed your boat or managed your rental property. They hid in plain sight, wearing masks of normalcy while darkness churned beneath. She needed more. She needed something concrete. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Finch's daughters, now 63 years old and living in Vermont, responded to the FBI's request for information. Her name was Patricia Moreland, and when agents contacted her, she'd gone silent for a long moment before agreeing to meet. Agent Reeves drove to Burlington on April 18, to conduct the interview personally. Patricia lived in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by maple trees that were just beginning to bud. She was a retired schoolteacher, soft-spoken, with her father's broad features and careful way of moving. They sat in her kitchen, afternoon light filtering through lace curtains, and Patricia told her story. "I've thought about calling someone for years," she began, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. "But I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if it meant anything, and he was my father. How do you accuse your own father of something so terrible?" Reeves kept her voice gentle. "Tell me what you remember." Patricia took a shaky breath. "The summer those people disappeared, I was 31. I was teaching in Portland, but I came home for a few weeks in June to help my father with some repairs on his house. I was there when it happened, when those tourists went missing. Did your father seem different that summer? Anxious? Distracted?" "No, that's just it," he seemed relieved. "I know how that sounds. But after the police were done questioning him, after they'd searched the rental property and found nothing, he relaxed. Like a weight had been lifted. I remember thinking it was strange at the time. Everyone else in town was terrified, looking over their shoulders, afraid there was a killer among us. But my father seemed almost calm." Reeves leaned forward slightly. "Did he say anything about the case? Express any opinions about what might have happened?" Patricia nodded slowly. He said, "And I remember this exactly because it struck me as odd. He said some people deserve what they get." I asked him what he meant, and he just shook his head and changed the subject. But I kept thinking about it. Why would he say that about two young tourists who'd done nothing wrong? Is there anything else? Anything at all that seemed unusual?" Patricia set down her mug, her hands trembling. "There was one thing. About a week before those people disappeared, I found something in my father's workshop. He had a shed behind his house where he kept all his tools, his welding equipment, things from his years at the boatyard. I went in there looking for a hammer, and I saw drawings, blueprints sort of, sketches of something underground, a chamber with measurements, notes about ventilation or lack of it. I didn't understand what I was looking at. I asked him about it, and he got angry, really angry, told me to stay out of his workshop, that it was private. He'd never spoken to me like that before." Reeves felt ice water flow through her veins. "Do you know what happened to those drawings?" "I don't know. After he died, my sister and I cleaned out his house. We threw away so much stuff. If those papers were there, we probably tossed them. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand." "Patricia, this is important. Did your father ever mention Daniel or Rebecca Hartley specifically? Before they went missing?" Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "No, but there was something else. Something I've never told anyone because I didn't want to believe it could be connected. The year before the Hartleys disappeared, 1991, my father managed a different rental property. A couple stayed there for a week in August. Young, maybe in their 30s. I only remember because my father mentioned them once. He said they were rude, disrespectful, that they'd damaged some furniture and tried to skip out without paying. He was really angry about it." "Do you remember their names?" "No, I'm sorry, I don't." Reeves made a note to pull rental records from 1991. "Did anything happen to that couple?" Patricia's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I don't know. But there was a news story that fall about a car found abandoned near the coast. Maybe 40 miles south of Tidewater Cove, and the people who owned it were never found. I remember seeing it on the news and thinking about what my father had said. But I told myself I was being paranoid. People go missing all the time. It didn't mean anything. Except it might have meant everything." Back in Tidewater Cove, Reeves set her team to work pulling every missing persons case from Maine and the surrounding states between 1985 and 1995. She wanted to know if there were other victims, other young couples who'd vanished under similar circumstances. What they found made her skin crawl. In August 1991, Kevin and Jennifer Pruitt from New Hampshire had disappeared while vacationing in southern Maine. Their car was found abandoned near a beach access road. No bodies were ever recovered. The case went cold within months. In July 1989, Michael and Stephanie Torres from Connecticut vanished during a weekend trip to the Maine coast. Their belongings were found in their hotel room, untouched. They simply never returned. No trace of them was ever found. In September 1987, Brandon and Emily Whitmore from Massachusetts disappeared while camping near the shore. Search and rescue teams combed hundreds of acres of wilderness. Nothing. Nothing. All couples. All young. All vacationing on or near the coast. All within a 100-mile radius of Tidewater Cove. Reeves pulled property records for every vacation rental Walter Finch had managed between 1985 and 1995. The Pruitts had rented a beach house in 1991. Finch was the property manager. The Torres couple had stayed at a cottage in 1989. Finch managed that property too. The Whitmores had reserved a cabin through a rental agency. But when Reeves dug deeper, she found that the agency had subcontracted maintenance and key services to Walter Finch. The pattern was undeniable. Every missing couple had a connection to Finch, however tangential. He'd had access to their rental information, their arrival dates, their plans. But he'd known when they would be alone, when they would be vulnerable. But evidence of connection wasn't the same as evidence of guilt. Reeves needed physical proof. She needed something concrete that could definitively link Walter Finch to the crimes. The answer came from the underground chamber itself. When forensic teams had initially processed the scene, they'd collected hundreds of samples, soil, rock fragments, trace materials. But most of it was exactly what you'd expect to find in a sealed underground space that had been closed for 3 decades. But one sample, taken from a small shelf carved into the chamber wall, contained something unusual. Wood fragments, old, degraded, but still identifiable under microscopic analysis. The wood had come from a specific species of pine common to Maine, but what made it remarkable was the presence of a chemical preservative called chromated copper arsenate, or CCE. This compound had been widely used to treat lumber in the 1970s and 80s, but was phased out for most applications by the late 90s due to health concerns. The specific formulation of CCA found in the wood fragments matched a product line manufactured between 1975 and 1985. Records showed that Harborside Marine Services had purchased large quantities of CCA-treated lumber during that period for use in dock construction and boat repairs. But the real breakthrough came when forensic botanists analyzed pollen trapped in the wood grain. The pollen signature indicated the lumber had been stored in an environment containing specific plant species, Rosa rugosa, Ammophila breviligulata, and Solidago sempervirens. In layman's terms, beach roses, American beach grass, and seaside goldenrod. These 3 species, in that specific combination, grew in only one location in Tidewater Cove, behind Walter Finch's house on Mariner's Way, where he'd kept his workshop and stored materials from his years at the boatyard. The wood found in the underground chamber had come from Finch's property. The evidence was scientifically sound, legally admissible, and utterly damning. But Walter Finch was dead. There would be no arrest, no trial, no opportunity for justice in a courtroom. The only thing left was the truth. Agent Reeves held a press conference on May 2, 2024, in the parking lot of the Tidewater Cove Town Hall. News cameras from every major network pointed at the podium. Reporters crowded close, notebooks ready, recorders extended. The families of all the missing couples sat in the front row, holding hands, bracing themselves for confirmation of what they'd suspected for decades. Reeves spoke clearly, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. She outlined the evidence. She explained the connections. She named Walter Finch as the primary suspect in the deaths of Daniel and Rebecca Hartley, and likely in the disappearances of at least 3 other couples between 1987 and 1991. She described a man who had lived two lives: the respectable retired welder, the helpful property manager, the widower who attended church on Sundays. And beneath that facade, a predator who selected victims carefully, who used his position of trust to gain access, who had built a torture chamber beneath the beach where he could enact his dark fantasies without fear of discovery. The motive, Reeves explained, might never be fully understood. But based on Patricia Morland's testimony and evidence found in journals recovered from Finch's house after his death, they believed he harbored deep resentment toward tourists, viewing them as disrespectful invaders who treated Tidewater Cove like their personal playground without appreciating its history or respecting its residents. In his twisted logic, he was teaching them a lesson, punishing them for their perceived arrogance, making them understand what it meant to be powerless, trapped, forgotten. The symbols carved into the victims' bodies were his signature, his mark of ownership. Forensic linguists had analyzed the patterns and determined they were not part of any known language or cultural practice. They were Finch's own creation, a private code that had meaning only to him. When Reeves finished speaking, the crowd erupted with questions. But she held up a hand, silencing them. There was one more thing. Ground-penetrating radar teams had been surveying the coastline near Saltmarsh Road for the past 2 weeks. They'd found anomalies. Other spaces carved into the bedrock, hidden beneath layers of sand and stone. Spaces that matched the construction pattern of the chamber where Daniel and Rebecca had been found. Excavation would begin the following week, and based on the radar signatures, they expected to find more victims, and the forecast proved accurate. On May 9th, excavation teams uncovered a second chamber approximately 200 yards from the first. Inside were the remains of 2 individuals, later identified through dental records as Kevin and Jennifer Pruitt. Like the Hartleys, they'd been sealed underground and left to die. Like the Hartleys, their bodies bore the same strange symbols carved into desiccated skin. On May 15th, a third chamber was opened. Michael and Stephanie Torres. Same method, same symbols, same slow, agonizing death in darkness. By May 23rd, 6 chambers had been discovered, all within a quarter-mile stretch of beach, all containing the remains of young couples who'd come to Maine seeking relaxation and beauty, only to encounter a monster who had hidden among them for decades. Brandon and Emily Whitmore were found in Chamber 4. Chamber 5 contained the remains of 2 individuals who would take weeks to identify, a couple from New York named Jason and Larita Kellerman, who'd been reported missing in 1985, but whose disappearance had never been investigated thoroughly because they'd been transient, drifting from place to place, no family to push for answers. The 6th chamber held perhaps the most heartbreaking discovery. A couple who had never been reported missing at all, on no identification, no missing persons report that matched their description. They'd been forgotten by everyone except the man who'd killed them. Forensic anthropologists estimated they'd been in that chamber since sometime in the mid to late 80s. They'd been erased from the world so completely that even now, in 2024, with all the resources of modern law enforcement focused on identifying them, their names remained unknown. Tidewater Cove was devastated. The town that had prided itself on safety, on being a refuge from the chaos of the modern world, had harbored a serial killer for decades. Walter Finch had lived among them, attended town meetings, waved to neighbors, helped with community events. And all the while he'd been murdering people and burying them beneath the beach where children played and families picnicked. The psychological impact rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. People who'd known Finch questioned their own judgment. How had they missed the signs? Had there been warning signals they'd ignored? Patricia Morland was hospitalized briefly for anxiety and depression, overwhelmed by guilt that she might have prevented later murders if she'd spoken up in 1992. Her sister refused all interview requests, retreating into silence and isolation. And the families of the victims faced their own reckoning. After decades of uncertainty, they finally had answers. But answers brought no comfort. Their loved ones had died in unimaginable terror, suffering for days in sealed tombs, with no hope of rescue. And the cruelty of it was almost beyond comprehension. Daniel Hartley's brother gave a statement to the press in late May. He stood on the steps of the county courthouse, his face haggard, his voice hollow. "We spent 32 years wondering, hoping maybe they'd run away, started a new life somewhere, and that hope is what kept us going. Now we know the truth, and honestly, I wish we didn't. I wish we could go back to not knowing. Because this is worse than anything we imagined." Rebecca's sister didn't make a statement. She simply returned to Ohio, carrying an urn containing her sister's ashes, finally able to lay her to rest after 3 decades of limbo. The investigation continued through the summer. Behavioral analysts constructed a detailed profile of Walter Finch, trying to understand what had created such a monster. His Navy records showed no red flags. Leah's work history was exemplary. His neighbors remembered him as quiet but friendly. His daughters had no memories of abuse or violence in their childhood. But buried in the journals found in his house, written in cramped handwriting over decades, was the chronicle of a man consumed by rage. He wrote about tourists with venomous contempt, describing them as parasites, invaders, people who took and took without giving anything back. He wrote about feeling invisible, powerless, watching wealthy visitors treat his town like a commodity to be consumed and discarded. The journals detailed his plans with chilling precision. He'd started building the underground chambers in 1982, working at night when the beach was deserted, using his skills from Harborside Marine to create spaces that would never be discovered. It had taken him 3 years to complete the first chamber. By 1985, he'd finished 6. These first victims were Jason and Rita Kellerman in August 1985. The journals described how he'd rented them a property, watched them, studied their routines, how he'd confronted them one evening, telling them there was a problem with the water heater that needed immediate attention. They'd followed him outside, trusting, unsuspecting. He'd incapacitated them with chloroform, a chemical he had easy access to through his work. Then he'd transported them to the chamber and sealed them inside. He described returning to the chamber days later, listening at the hatch, hearing their screams grow weaker. He described the sense of power it gave him, the feeling of control. He described carving the symbols into their bodies after they'd died, marking them as his. The journals chronicled every murder in detail, and the planning, the execution, the aftermath. But Finch wrote about the thrill of living a double life, of sitting in church on Sunday mornings knowing what he'd done, knowing that the people around him would never suspect. He wrote about the satisfaction of seeing the town's paranoia after the Hartleys disappeared, watching everyone suspect each other while the real killer moved among them invisibly. The final entry in the journals was dated March 2017, just weeks before Finch's death. He was 86 years old, in failing health, confined to an assisted living facility. He knew he was dying. And in that final entry he expressed no remorse, no regret. Only satisfaction that he'd never been caught, that he'd taken his secrets with him to the grave. Except the grave had given up those secrets after all. The storm in 2024 had exposed his crimes. The earth itself had betrayed him. By September 2024, the investigation was winding down. All 6 chambers had been excavated. All victims had been identified except for the couple in Chamber 6, who remained nameless despite extensive efforts. The families had been notified. The remains had been returned for proper burial. Agent Reeves submitted her final report to FBI headquarters in October, and the case of the Tidewater Cove murders was officially closed. Walter Finch, deceased, was identified as the perpetrator of at least 12 murders between 1985 and 1991, possibly more. The investigation had found no evidence of additional chambers, but ground-penetrating radar surveys of the entire coastline would continue for the next year, just to be certain. The town of Tidewater Cove was forever changed. Tourism dropped precipitously. Who wanted to vacation in a place where a serial killer had hunted couples for nearly a decade? The Chamber of Commerce tried to rebrand, emphasizing the town's resilience, its commitment to healing, but the stain remained. Every time someone mentioned Tidewater Cove, the conversation inevitably turned to Walter Finch and his underground graves. The beach where the chambers had been found was closed permanently. The town council voted to turn the area into a memorial park, a place where people could come to remember the victims, to reflect on the darkness that had touched their community. A simple granite monument was erected, bearing the names of those who'd been identified and a single line for those who remained nameless. Here lie souls who were taken too soon, forgotten by some but remembered by all. In December 2024, Patricia Morland returned to Tidewater Cove for the first time since her father's death. She stood at the memorial, tears streaming down her face, and spoke to the gathered families. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry I didn't see it. I'm sorry I didn't stop him. I'm sorry for every life he destroyed. I wish I could change the past. I wish I could bring them back. But I can't. All I can do is stand here and promise that they won't be forgotten. Their stories won't be buried again." And the families embraced her, offering forgiveness she didn't feel she deserved. They understood that she was a victim too, in her own way. They understood that monsters don't announce themselves. They hide in plain sight, wearing the faces of ordinary people, committing extraordinary evil behind closed doors. As winter settled over the Maine coast, bringing grey skies and bitter winds, Tidewater Cove grew quiet, and the news crews left. The FBI packed up their evidence and returned to Boston. Life slowly resumed its normal rhythms, though nothing would ever truly be normal again. On the last day of the year, Sheriff Patricia Dalton stood alone on the beach near the memorial. She looked out at the Atlantic, its waves rolling in with the same endless rhythm they'd maintained for millennia, indifferent to human suffering, indifferent to the horrors that had occurred beneath the sand. She thought about Daniel and Rebecca Hartley, young and in love, coming to this place for a simple vacation. She thought about all the victims, all the lives cut short by one man's twisted rage. She thought about how close Finch had come to getting away with it completely, how if the storm hadn't exposed that first chamber, his crimes might have remained hidden forever. Evil had lived in Tidewater Cove for decades, wearing a mask of normalcy, moving among the innocent like a wolf among sheep. And the most terrifying realization was this: if it happened here in this quiet coastal town where everyone knew everyone, it could happen anywhere. The monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like neighbors. Sometimes they're the ones who fix your boat or manage your rental property or wave to you from across the street. Sometimes they're the person you'd least suspect. As darkness fell over the Atlantic, Sheriff Dalton turned away from the water and walked back to her car. Behind her, the memorial stood silent in the gathering night, a reminder of lives lost and questions that would never be fully answered. The case was closed. The investigation was complete. Justice, such as it was, had been served. But the victims remained dead, their final moments of terror frozen in time, a darkness that would never fully fade from the memory of those who remained. And somewhere beneath the earth, in Chamber 6, two people lay nameless and forgotten, their identities lost to history, their stories untold. The storm had revealed Walter Finch's secrets. But some mysteries, it seemed, would remain buried forever. The end. The end. Why couldn't? Why can't you?